Here we have a counter and a button to increment it. Whenever this button is clicked, it calls increment counter. Increment counter calls set counter, and it increments our counter state variable by 1. Now let's say we want to add another button here that increments the counter by 2. How do we do that? Let's first call this button increment counter by 1, and let's add one more button, and let's call it increment counter by 2. And let's also add a step parameter to our increment counter function and increment our counter value by step. Now, how can we pass an argument to our increment counter event handler function here? At first, you might be thinking of doing something like this. But be careful here. What we want is to assign a function to our onClick property to be called whenever the click event happens. But what we're doing here is we're calling increment counter with the argument 1, and we're assigning the return value of this to our onClick property here. And that's not what we want. This returns undefined. It doesn't return anything. And we don't want to assign undefined to onClick. So what can we do? The first thing we can do is to use arrow functions. And it will work just like this. Well, now what this does is it passes an arrow function to the onClick property, and that arrow function, whenever it is called, it calls increment counter with the argument 1, and here it calls increment counter with the argument 2. Now let's see if it works. This button is working, and this button is working as well. Now for this very simple example, this is all fine. We can do this. But I don't really like using arrow functions. And the reason for that is, let's first just imagine that this arrow function here, at the moment it only increments the counter by 1, but let's say you want to do other stuff here as well, and you're maybe doing, you're calling an API, or you're calling other functions, and you're doing other stuff. And now this is getting longer, and if you ask me, in my opinion, this is getting uglier. I prefer to keep my JSX code clean. I want it to only describe how the component looks. I don't want it to deal with how the component acts. So I don't like to keep these in arrow functions normally. So let's just separate this into a function. Let's call that function handle increment counter by 1 click. And in this, let's call increment counter with the argument 1. And now let's assign that function to here, to this property here. And let's do the same thing for the other one, for the other button. And we'll call this handle increment counter by 2 click. Let's change this to 2, and here we'll do increment counter by 2. Let's see if it's still working. And perfect, it's still working. Now, why did we do this? It looks like we just added some code, and it doesn't look like we improved anything at all, actually. And again, for this very simple example, if you're thinking that way, you're probably right. It's just, it didn't really do much for us. But there are two things that I want you to notice here. The first thing is, again, we just cleaned it up. We just separated our arrow functions into separate functions here so that they don't clutter up our JSX code. That's the first improvement. And the second one is, you might be wondering here, why are we calling this event handler function with this name? It's kind of awkward. We're calling it handle increment counter by 1 click. Why not call this something like increment counter by 1? This name is very descriptive. It tells exactly what this function is doing, and it might be argued that this is a better name for this function, but I would disagree. And the reason for that is also similar to what I explained earlier. Let's say right now it just does increment the counter by 1, but let's say you want to do other stuff in this event handler. Whenever the button is clicked, maybe, again, you want to call an API, call other functions, and you're doing other stuff here. And when you're doing other stuff, now this function does not only increment the counter by 1, it does other stuff. And the name now is meaningless. For that reason, I choose to name my event handler functions with this format. I call it handle, and then the name of whatever that input or element is, and in this case, increment counter by 1, and then the name of the event. And in this case, it's the click event. Let's just go back and fix this too. And that's it. That's the reason why I prefer to have these in separate functions. All right, that's it for this episode. I hope you found it useful and enjoyed it. See you in the next one.